Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina. Normally, it's from the US. This time, it's from Europe for today. Welcome to the show once again.
Thank you so much. Very glad to be here as always.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show. So, Irina, several big topics again today, and this time we'll be starting with, Netanyahu's Prime Minister Netanyahu's apology to Qatar, with Trump looking on at the White House. Help us understand what this is all about. How should people understand this? Or what does it mean for Gaza? What does it mean for the world? What does it mean for the White House and Trump?
Now, supposedly, the whole point of this apology was to smooth over the edges before the beginning of the peace process. Um, in reality, it's all a bit of a theater because everyone knows perfectly well that Qatar was not damaged, um, that Qatar had it coming because they had refused to expel the Hamas leaders or to put them on trial or to give them over to Israel to do anything with them. And not only did they host a terrorist organization long after that outlived any utility it had to the U.S. and Israel, which is how it all started to begin with, but they actually encouraged them to not release the hostages. And in other words, they manipulated that situation to prolong the war. Now, technically, people put a lot of emphasis that Netanyahu did not actually apologize for the failed attack, but he only apologized for killing accidentally a Qatari official who happened to be present. But the question is, why? There is a information that supposedly the U.S. leaked warned Qatar about an impending attack at least a few minutes, 10 minutes before it happened. The question is, why was that Qatari official or security officer still there? Why was Qatari security dealing with Hamas? If they want to host them, it's one thing, but why are they legitimizing them? Why is there intelligence relationship between them? And all of that in itself raises many eyebrows. But the bottom line is neither Qatar, nor Hamas, nor anyone in the Middle East cares about the exact and precise wording of the apology. All they care, or the reasons for that matter, all they care is that it happened, that the optics were that there was a Qatari official, a very corrupt fixer with a bad reputation present in the room when it happened, and that Trump allowed the Qataris to prevail on this issue, despite the fact that all of this is very symbolic, and nobody was truly shocked that any of this happened, especially since Israel had been going after Hamas leaders in many other countries, and no one made them apologize for that. We are talking about Lebanon, we are talking about Iran. So this is definitely not the first time Israel went into another country to kill off terrorist members of terrorist organizations when the country was unable or unwilling to do so. And of course, the message from this is that ultimately Qatar is prevailing, even if it's entirely symbolic. No, it's important. The message of strength that Qatar has managed to gain out of it is that it carries to not only its followers, but people in the middle who don't really care about Hamas and don't really care about anything other than seeing who is actually the strongest horse in the region. I think this was a huge disfavor to Israel and a huge favor to Qatar. And Trump indicated by insisting on this particular gesture, regardless of the formulation and the optics and the release of these photographs, that he is indeed actually favoring Qatar on this matter, and he is equating Qatar to Israel. And by the way, the fact that he's almost simultaneously provided Qatar with security guarantees is an even bigger pragmatic point than the apology itself, because the security guarantee elevates Qatar to a level very few allies actually enjoy. Israel is might be one of them, but probably not to the same, even to the same level in terms of wording. Essentially, the security guarantee is that if Qatar is attacked, U.S. will treat it as an attack on itself and will essentially be sending Americans to defend Qatar. Now, many people have questions whether Trump would actually go through with that, given given the fact that he has an aversion to entanglements and foreign conflicts. And the reality is, Qatar not only has a U.S. base but a Turkish base to protect it from serious attempts at coups or anything like that. And in this particular scenario, as we already said, Israel was not aiming at Qatar leadership; it was aiming at Hamas. But Qatar seems to be interpreting this violation very broadly, and it seems to be interpreting it to invoke it at any time it pleases. For instance, when Iran attacked a U.S. base in Qatar, Qatar complained a little bit, but nobody seemed to mind. There were no there was no drama on the same level, and certainly nobody demanded apologies from the Iranian leadership, even if they complained. So we are seeing that this is less about the actual apology and more about simply strong arming Israel and giving Qatar political leverage, even if it's never actually invoked in practice.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So, a couple of questions here. Uh, do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu, he was taken aback because he is, the pictures tell a very different sort of a story to the world. Not only it happened, the pictures were taken and also released to the media. So that is one part. And why did he agree to this? Secondly, why is Qatar so important to Trump?
Now, from Netanyahu's perspective, I don't think he was expecting Trump to go so far. Trump certainly complained about it afterwards, particularly when it turned out that the attack did not deliver and it failed. But I don't think Netanyahu thought that he would be made to apologize. He thought that Trump's statement to Qatar that it would never happen again would suffice. The fact that this ritual humiliation was actually imposed shows, on the one hand, that Trump is losing patience with Netanyahu for whatever reason, and we don't know everything that's going on, and I doubt it's for the reasons that the media necessarily talks about. And the other is that Qatar's growing importance with vis-a-vis Israel is recalibrating the entire geopolitical chessboard in terms of U.S. interests, and that's a very deep concern that goes well beyond Netanyahu's personality, and it may impact any of his successors, no matter where they are and no matter what their relationship with either Trump or any other future American president is. The fact that for the first time, U.S. actually prioritized Qatar on the same level or above Israel is a message that will not be lost on anybody, including Israel's enemies. And if Israel is watching the Gaza riots that are taking place all over the West, I think Netanyahu probably figures that all of these people were certainly emboldened by what happened. It's not just Hamas propaganda, but the messaging that these forces that back Hamas are also gaining power and approval from the US administration. Otherwise, I doubt so many people would have been so brazen and felt so empowered and made so demands. One of the posters in London, I believe, said, "We are the majority." In other words, they claim to be either speaking for the majority of public opinion in the United Kingdom or for the majority of public opinion um, among in the Middle East or in the world. I don't know what exactly they're referring to, but they were certainly stating a claim that they're not going to go anywhere. And this is the first time I was seeing that particular claim, the claim to be the moral majority on this matter. And I don't think it would have been possible had the backers of Hamas not felt so confident in being able to make their terms known. And without Trump's role in this, none of that would be happening. I don't think it's just because of the European leaders who recognize Palestine, although that certainly didn't help. But I think this particular thing emboldened them, contributed even more than that, in my opinion. Now, why is Qatar so important to Trump? I don't think it's a matter of just the airplane or even Qatar's public investments in the United States. The reality is, Trump's family is incredibly intertwined with Qatar on many levels, not only from starting with the properties they're doing, that they've built there, to the fact that multiple close associates of Trump have been doing all sorts of business with Qatar for decades. And also the fact that Trump's son is now literally trying to attract Qatari funding to the MAGA movement. Don Jr. and his Qatar-backed US-born partner Omar Malik presented at the Doha Economic Forum, and they had a panel that said monetizing MAGA, basically how Qatar can take advantage of the MAGA movement by putting its money there. So, given this political conflict of interest, it's very obvious that Trump is driven by something more than considering Qatar, an important mediator for what it's worth. Clearly, there is a financial business stake on Qatar here that he does not think Israel can replicate, even with all of its scientific and technological achievements, because Israel simply does not have as much money.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. One more thing is that okay, you wanted to make a point. You wanted the visiting Prime Minister of Israel to make a statement or talk to the authorities there in Qatar. But why to release these pictures? How good or how bad diplomacy it is? You see, if I'll put it, these pictures released by the White House, they say a very different story, and that is where the problem is, that if we show it, these are the two pictures all released by the White House. We've taken it from there, and these days, see, the phone is in Trump's hands. Mr. Netanyahu is looking at it. Other officials are also looking at. Means how good it is or bad it is for diplomacy between, because these pictures will be there in the minds of everyone, including Mr. Netanyahu, Israel, and the people there.
I would say that this is actually worse for Trump than it is for Netanyahu. Or rather, it's worse for the United States than it's worse for Netanyahu. Netanyahu can always say, look, at the end of the day, Trump is Trump. I can't control who he is, politically in bed with, and I have to do whatever it takes to protect my country's interests, even if it means totally humiliating myself. He can make that claim. But for Trump to be doing the bidding while there's a Qatari fixer in the room, that is a whole different story. That is indicating that the US is being controlled by a foreign interest. And unlike the conspiracy theorists who claim that foreign interest is Israel, very clearly that picture indicates that if there is anyone controlling any aspect of US policy, it's Qatar. So while Trump
Absolutely.
may not care about that optics, in terms of long-term damage to the United States, it's incalculable, and I think most people don't realize it.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to this particular incident to the Trump's peace plan. What is happening in Gaza for a normal person from this part of the world? They keep on listening about this thing, wondering about peace. Now there is Trump's peace plan. How should we understand where we are on this particular issue, Arina?
Well, there are different people expressing cautious optimism. For instance, Egypt's President Sisi invited Trump to Cairo to any future signing of the peace deal if it comes through. So that invitation is conditional, but at the same time, I doubt he would be offering it if there was absolutely no chance that it was happening. Um, uh, there are certainly many people. Netanyahu himself had said that he believes the hostages will be back in Israel very shortly, and there are many people who think that for the time being, at least the active phase of hostilities will be over. However, there are several disturbing signs that point that this whole process may not work out as smoothly as people believe, or that it may be merely a brief pause before before events take a turn for something much more dark and sinister. Reason being, Trump initially gave a 72-hour ultimatum to Hamas to produce the hostages, not to negotiate, not to make deals, not to provide new terms, but to produce the hostages. It's been well over 72 hours since he made that proposition. That time expired Sunday evening, and yet here we are. Not only are there no hostages, but Israel unilaterally pulled back in Gaza. There are teams negotiating in Cairo with Kushner and Witkoff involved, and Hamas is proposing additional demands, and not a single hostage, including any of the living ones who are certainly Hamas knows where they are and who desperately need medical attention. Not one of them has been released, not even moved to a place where they could be released quickly, provided that the first phase of the deal goes through. Uh, many Israeli analysts cynically believe that even if the entire deal goes through and the international community moves into Gaza to reconstruct and so on and so forth, Hamas is not going anywhere, and the international community will continue accusing Israel of war crimes and mass atrocities and blaming the war on Israel rather than on Hamas itself. And essentially, the terms of the deal are shaped in such a way that they absolve Hamas and especially Qatar and even Iran of any accountability for the events of the past 2 years and for the thousands of people who have died, including both civilians and Israeli soldiers, and of course, civilians in Gaza who were killed as a result of Hamas holding its Gazan population hostage in order to claim its resistance narrative. What is also true, and that is observable worldwide, is that the resistance narrative has taken hold across diaspora communities around the world. So even if Hamas is forced to relinquish power in Gaza temporarily, the diaspora can carry on the story and continue to cause problems and attack the Jewish communities in various countries in the name of this cause. They are actually calling for the rejection of this deal uh, uh, very openly, even though that deal would be good for everybody. It would mean that innocent people would be released. It would mean that the Hamas, which has grown quite unpopular in Gaza, would go away. It would mean that the war would come to an end. Israel would withdraw. Gaza would be reconstructed. These people want the war to keep going, and there's a lot of them, and their voices are quite persistent. And the latest development is that Giorgia Meloni, who has very little to do with this conflict indeed, has been referred to, along with two officials, to the ICC as a war criminal for allegedly enabling the war in Gaza, even though she had publicly defended Qatar and portions of her government pushed for freezing defense trade with Israel. So uh, I don't think this is going to be resolved quite as simply and easily as people think. I think Hamas may very well be using this opportunity to pull a fast one on everybody. The two possible scenarios I can see is either it's outright lying, and this is yet another delay before breaking a ceasefire and renewing attacks through rockets or through something else, and it has no intention of releasing hostages, or it is doing only just enough to survive politically, and it may release a few hostages and then continue extending this process indefinitely and dangling whoever remains for as long as possible.
Absolutely, Irina. Absolutely, lots of plans there. But what about this talk about Pakistan forces? Maybe they will be going for Gaza for stabilization, because a lot of this talk, visit of Pakistan Prime Minister to the White House along with the powerful general, and then this whole oil talk again happening again. What's happening? Where is the oil? Where is Pakistan's role? Why is all this talk happening about the oil and Pakistan's so-called, possible, engagement in Gaza peace process?
So here's an interesting thing. Pakistan seems to be getting back to Trump's good graces. I think, the oil deals, I believe, are separate from the defensive arrangement. What's, curious, there may be a couple of reasons for why Trump would even consider Pakistani troops in Gaza. First, because he may not believe that Arab troops would be sufficient, or that there would be enough voluntary contributions, or that they could keep the order due to their own internal interests in this area. The other issue is that because he is dealing with Pakistan on other unrelated issues such as oil, he may believe that it can just strengthen the relationship to get Pakistan engaged in everything, just as he happens to do with his other business partners. Once they have earned his trust, or they're entangled in some ways, they may be entangled in many ways. It may also be that Pakistan actually wants to be involved, whether because of business contracts and opportunities it offers, whether due to its defense pact with Saudi Arabia, that would then it interprets very liberally to also mean some sort of a supporting role in Gaza, or whether because there's an ulterior motives and some factions seek to capitalize and install themselves as a power in the Middle East. That's certainly a possibility, possibly along with Turkey, or in some capacity advancing Turkish aligned interests as well. All of these things are plausible, that the condition for doing business with Trump was this arrangement, or that Trump, on the other hand, thought it was a good idea, and multiple interests were met in that way. I think this is an exceptionally risky undertaking. I also don't think it's going to work, quite frankly. First of all, the lack of common language, despite the fact that many Pakistanis have gone to study in Saudi Arabia and so forth, and other Middle Eastern countries, overwhelmingly they do not speak Arabic, so that the language barrier is going to be first and the most obvious problem. Second, I don't know if anyone in the region will accept their authority, especially Gazans themselves. And third, I I suspect that there's going to be security concerns by Israel, because Pakistan does not have diplomatic relations with Israel, and at the same time it's outside of the region. So Unlike Qatar, it can't even claim a localized direct interest in the matter. So I think there are many obstacles to the implementation of that plan. The fact that they're being discussed doesn't mean that they will come to fruition. Many things that Trump has discussed or ultimately did not materialize. Um, but what's worth noting is that nevertheless, Trump at the same time is pushing the oil aspect of this whole situation just as much. He made claims that there's a massive US brokered oil deal with Pakistan, not just his own personal interest, but apparently that is simply not true. It just nothing happened. So why is Trump making such unsupportable comments? First of all, most people are not going to fact check. They're not going to care, and many of them may be genuinely confused and not know the difference between the private deals that he may be making and a U.S. government official deal. The other thing is he needs diplomatic and economic wins as the relationship with India is deteriorating and actually undercutting some of the regional plans for the Indo-Pacific security alliance. Trump is, and it's increasingly looking like India is going to be buying more Russian oil rather than less. Trump needs to make it look like somebody like US is getting an economic win somewhere, and Pakistan seems to be a relatively easy target because um, it will play into the interests of those who claim that Pakistan is overly dependent on China and therefore want to attract Pakistan back to the United States. And quite frankly, it's just easy because Pakistan is not going to be arguing with Trump. Pakistan wants to please Trump and wants financial infusions from the US. We have seen that Pakistan was very happy to nominate Trump for the Nobel Prize over his claim to have played a role in the dispute in the violent altercation with India after terrorist attacks in Kashmir. So we are seeing that Pakistan is very much trying to get back into Trump's good graces, and Trump seems pleased to try to normalize them and welcome back into the fold because he's seeing potential opportunities, both politically in terms of making claims that he's made a new ally and or restored an old alliance, and also in terms of business opportunities for himself. It's probably also helps Pakistan, giving Pakistan's leadership a domestic win to justify closer coordination with Washington and some of the Arab states. It's a There are some factions in Pakistan that have floated the idea of joining Abraham Accords or at least decriminalizing relations with Israel. There are also other factions that are staunchly opposed to that. So this energy cover could potentially give an excuse to those other factions that are more open to Trump's Middle East integration vision to play a bigger role if they are the ones who bring in some sort of a win, whether it's from Trump or from anyone else. Of course, once it turns out that nobody is actually benefiting from that, that narrative will likely fall apart on its own. Um,
Absolutely.
and
Carry
of
on.
course,
Carry
all of that is a matter of prestige for the Pakistan's military establishment because leading a multilateral stabilization force in Gaza will make them look important.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was very, very telling and very open when the prime minister as well as the general are in the White House at the same time, and especially the general, the second time in just a very few months, where people have to understand it, why this whole optics is happening. But we be that as it may, we move from talking of Pakistan and talking of India. Let's talk of India. India is moving more towards China reapproachment with Russia, renewed flights, direct flights with to China, and trade talks with US still continue. Where does this all seem to be going in your understanding, Irina?
Well, we are seeing quite a conundrum. The relationship, with India appears to be deteriorating, even as the trade talks are still ongoing. Still, there hasn't been a very decisive breakthrough. Nothing specific and concrete to report beyond the fact that the two parties are optimistic about reaching um, some sort of a positive conclusion on some areas, while other areas remain very difficult to resolve. India is very much trying to project strategic autonomy in that sense and project multilateralism. Of course, some in Europe are viewing it as uh, evidence of being unreliable, of being excessively beholden to pro-Russian interests and uh, an unprincipled and unscrupulous and short-sighted player who will ultimately going to be misled and deceived and betrayed by China as a result of all these relations. Um, at the same time, I don't think that this situation is driven by any sort of ideology. I think it's entirely pragmatic in nature. We are talking about discounted crude, even as the United States is raising prices. We're talking about cheap and easy fertilizer imports and continuation of arms servicing for technologies that are sort of already there. Um, at the same time, I think India is trying to diversify supply chains and keep leverage in as many major geopolitical players as possible. For instance, the restoration of direct flights to China is an attempt at cautious normalization and improving relations, at least on a people to people level. And it also would have a practical impact of essentially helping India's exporters and especially pharmaceutical firms to counter Trump's tariffs by reopening a major market. And at the same time, it would play the role of restoring communication with its most consequential rival. But the trust really isn't there, and certainly not yet. I don't think anyone should jump to conclusions that India is simply throwing caution to the wind. I think it views this issue as an matter of economic utility, not a strategic reopening. And I also think it may not work out necessarily in the long run. For instance, if it becomes obvious that China is abusing this opening to introduce meddling in India's economy or in India's politics, I think that will be brought to an end very quickly. And I also don't necessarily see that. In the end, the economic interests will align as smoothly as people believe. At the end of the day, the two countries are still rivals on many issues, including pharmaceuticals. And I think many in India will be concerned about attracting too much economic capital from China because disentangling later will be much harder. At the end of the day, US is still has still not given up on India. It's still seeking greater access for US tech and agricultural exports. India still wants more visa flexibility because it too views US as a valuable partner and it wants the tariff barriers to be lowered. Um, the Indo-Pacific framework has not fully fallen apart, and there is an effort now to link trade concessions by both sides to defense collaboration, supply chain shifts, and technology transfers. So now India is essentially trying to balance the three different vectors with different function. In terms of the way India views it, Russia supplies defense depth, China represents economic scale, and US is still anchoring technological and strategic advancement. And for now, India will try to maintain equilibrium until such time that there is a reason to shift um, towards one member of the triangle in a decisive way. And so far, with Trump in office, I doubt that reason will come. I think even if the tariff situation were to improve or to change, I think the government will be wary after what has transpired, and it will be less trusting um, of this administration in terms of its transactionalism and sudden swings of interest and unexpected points of pressure. I do still think that India will be shifting away from Russian procurement over time, regardless of the current political signals, simply as a matter of its own interests. And it, even if it doesn't substantially increase trade with the US, it will at the very least be investing into its own domestic platforms and also Western co-production with various countries. We are seeing that there is an aggressive pursuit of a free trade deal with Europe, which is a major development as well. Um, uh, and
Absolutely.
of course, and of course, India will try to leverage its own role and importance. Uh, for Washington, India would still be an ideal cornerstone for the Indo-Pacific stability. For Moscow, it's been a loyal customer. For Beijing, it's a competitor that can be managed or is worth managing, and there is economic value in managing it, even if the strategic issues are not resolvable. So India also has some diplomatic bandwidth to play with. There's also an intelligence purpose to pursuing renewed connectivity with China. Diplomatic presence and business travel will restore channels for observing internal Chinese dynamics firsthand, which is critical for calibrating both the border posture and the trade strategy overall. Of course, China will likely be doing the same, so that's something to remember, to keep in mind.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. As they say in international politics, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests, and every country is free to do things that works for their interests. Just like US is doing, every other country is doing. India is also. Whether it moves away from Russia or even China later on, that's again it will be its own pragmatic approach. When countries start dominating and telling others what to do, that is where the issue starts becoming, and this is where we are standing with the US and India relation, in spite of the so much of natural connection between the two countries. Be that as it may, let's move on to a lot of happenings internationally, especially this anti-corruption and economic protests. They moved almost like moving on from Nepal to Morocco as well as Madagascar. What's happening? Means, is this some new movement by the young generation? The world is watching. They are watching. What is it that is happening in so many other parts of the world, Irina?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like the new Arab Spring, is taking place around the world. And on the one level, there is, a great deal of corruption, and there are economic difficulties. And because of social media, there's a lot less patience for economic difficulties, and there's poor governance in various parts of the world. Um, and economic discontent is entering a global rhythm of unrest. On the other hand, it's almost like some people with their own interests are watching what happens in one place and using it as a convenient political cover to advance their own agendas. They find that it's easy to get people animated and angry over economic uncertainty, and there's been many global factors to that. aside from internal factors like corruption. There's been COVID that's been mishandled by the entire international community. Very few, if any, countries did it, perfectly well. There's been the Russia-Ukraine war that also disrupted a lot of supply chain and caused major economic and political differences in very disparate regions of the world, from Africa to Central Asia and beyond. There's been all sorts of factors that count into this. So it's certainly easy to get people frustrated, disaffected, exhausted people, on board with rallies. But that doesn't mean that there aren't also agendas that are driven by an interest in destabilizing, in polarizing, or simply diverting attention from other equally important and equally concerning matters. So on the surface, all these events in Nepal, in Morocco, and Madagascar share a moral banner: anti-corruption, inflation relief, fair governance, all good slogans, right? But competing forces are trying to shape the direction of where those demands and protests are going. And they may be trying to turn legitimate grievances into potential geopolitical instruments. For instance, in Nepal, demonstrations over inflation and job scarcity began organically, and there was a great deal of dissatisfaction with also anti-democratic crackdowns by the previous government. But they have been amplified by factions that had their own, political reasons to weaken the governing coalition and to court popular support. And of course, organized crime groups rode on that same wave for their own reasons, and China and others may have had their own interests, for the same reason China had an interest in Bangladesh, for instance. There is a genuine disillusionment among youth, compounded by post-pandemic stagnation and remittance dependency. It created fertile ground for agitation, certainly, but the risk is not in the fact that young people are taking charge, but in the ideological hijacking by groups seeking to destabilize Nepal and its regional balance. And of course, we have seen that these protests were not innocuous. They ended in bloodshed. The government turned out to be much more violent than anyone might expect. And also, violent groups infiltrated the protests or took advantage of the protests to also do horrific things, burning down buildings and so forth, and killing and beating up officials, and turning to violence as well. In Morocco, some of the protests, the official positions included high living costs, drought-induced economic pain, and perceptions of elite impunity over various matters. There were genuine calls for transparency and accountabilities, but at the same time, there is no doubt that the Islamist networks and radical left factions have tried to fold the movement into broader anti-Western narratives. The timing of these protests, when nothing major economically was happening, to suddenly launch this anti-corruption protest, I doubt it was coincidental. And I think there's increasing evidence pointing to the fact that the so-called Red-Green Alliance had its hand in inflaming the worst of it, including extreme level of violence against the police, with over 200 people injured, that we know of, and several protesters were also killed by the police in the process. So far, there hasn't been an open attack on the monarchy, but every time something like that happens and gets out of hand, it has an indirect impact on the monarchy, because the message from the Islamist groups is, look, they're not really responding to your calls. They're not. There is no intervention with the government by the monarchy. What is their real role in there, and so on and so forth. So they're trying to send this indirect message of uncertainty to plant seeds of doubt about the role of the monarchy and how it can manage to stabilize the country and to right the wrongs by elected officials. It's a very dangerous situation that I think can easily get out of hand, and I think at some point it may some of these forces, if they feel that the security agencies are not able to handle it, may try to use it to leverage extreme concessions politically, to be brought back to political power. For instance, SPGG, the Muslim Brotherhood political party in Morocco, was brought back in 2011 to account to sort of as a response to the Arab Spring, as a managed response to the Arab Spring. Did it ultimately, collapse the country? No, but it certainly caused a great deal of it certainly didn't help with the corruption, and arguably it also strengthened the policies internally that were antithetical to the efforts by the monarchy to advance more pro-Western, more integrated regional agenda. So I think this is what these factions are trying to right for, at the very least, be brought back officially into political power, or cause enough instabilization to be able to seize concessions until the point that they can push for something even more. I don't think they're going to stop. And in Madagascar, of course, inflation, unemployment, food insecurity have all combined into a very combustible mix. Civil society has been demanding better governance for a very long time, but there are also foreign linked NGOs and political opportunities finding discontent to reshape the electoral map. Local crises are being magnified by external narratives into region-wide contagion. Now, Madagascar has had its share of troubles, to be sure, but it's simply not clear whether these foreign interests are really there to advance the democracy, rule of law, and the transparency, or whether they simply want to seize power for their own proxies. What differentiates this wave from the original Arab Spring is coordination, because today we have the digital platforms, the influencer networks, and the encrypted messaging can amplify grievances across borders in real time, much more so than it was possible in 2011, when it was relatively easy to shut off some internet or to disrupt the protests. The connectivity accelerated mobilization, but it also blurred authenticity. Foreign agitators can steer discourse and research flow without physical presence with much more ease. And of course, Arab Spring was infiltrated relatively quickly by Muslim Brotherhood groups. But even without those things, now with this foreign, with these platforms being much more developed, it's really even easier to hijack any cause than it's ever been before. So there is, of course, an opportunity to undercut pro-Western governments or to derail resource deals. Disinformation campaigns are popping up everywhere, and they're trying to also frame legitimate economic anger as evidence of systemic Western exploitation, and to feed populist sentiment that weakens any reformist technocrats. So we are seeing a lot of mixed messaging, and unfortunately, the most negative is the one that's more likely to become more popular, and it's easier to spread as well. The grievances,
Uh,
nevertheless, are real. Inflation is eroding wages in countries that are already, developing. Corruption has driven people to cynicism because they were hoping that, for instance, a more liberal government in Morocco would fix a lot of these issues that they were complaining with PJD, and it certainly it hasn't been to the extent that they expected, and compounded by external situations like post-COVID recovery, drought, and so forth. It certainly created a very difficult environment. Youth unemployment caused many young Moroccans, for instance, to look abroad, and is leading to a lot of brain drain and migration issues in Europe and so forth. So there's a lot of real problems, and unless the governments figure out how to address them in a way that is real, authentic, speaks, shows their genuine engagement and interest, this is not going to go away. And those puppet masters trying to manipulate the process are very likely to succeeding if they see that there is no that the government is not being accountable, that it's not listening to the people, and it's not trying reforms that will genuinely help solve those problems. So if
Absolutely.
and another issue is that the governments now can't really crack down too much on these demonstrations, because then you create martyr movements, and ignore them altogether only leads to more cynicism. So there needs to be a strike a balance, address root causes swiftly, but insulate public debate from covert manipulation, and not everybody is skilled at doing that.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. A lot of things happening in the world, and amidst all these things, and our last story of the day is about Japan. Japan selects its first women prime minister, Sanai Takaichi. What should we know about her?
Well, she is certainly very conservative, and that's something that's caught a lot of attention. Japan has gone through cycles of political instability with the same ruling party, and a much more populist and hardline anti-foreign, anti-immigration um, uh, party has challenged its hold on power. This Sonata Kaichi's elevation marks both continuity and quiet disruption of this political direction. She's a veteran lawmaker with very staunch conservative roots. She represents the more nationalist wing of the Liberal Democratic Party. She has long advocated for a stronger defense, for constitutional revision, and for a more assertive foreign policy. But she is also there to create a more modernizing image. She is the first female prime minister. It indicates social progression, even if her politics are actually anchored in very traditional values. And her leadership style is pragmatic and but principled. She has a reputation as being meticulous, unflinching, with deep expertise in economic security and industrial policy. So she's not just another big mouth, big talker, populist. She really has expertise, and she has a record of success. She's likely going to double down on supply chain resilience, push strategic investment in semiconductors, and also work on safeguarding critical technologies from Chinese acquisition. She will be pushing for more economic autonomy as the bedrock of national security, and um, even as there is a certainly certainly there is a trend towards weaponized interdependence. She is likely continue pushing for normalized deterrence, and she will probably accelerate spending towards the 2% of GDP benchmark, even though that's still going to be difficult for cultural reasons inside Japan. Very likely, she will probably invest in long range precision strike capabilities, and she will also likely deepen joint training with the US forces. Mm. She is a transition figure from previous pacifism to active defense, and trying to get the country ready in the face of Chinese maritime incursions and North Korean missile threats. Uh, of course, she will be heavily have to manage the relationship with the US, including Trump's unpredictability and tariff attacks. And you know, Japan's deterrence hinges in part on credible integration with the US systems and on shared intelligence. but I think she will try to be more autonomous than her predecessors in terms of execution, and she will want to see that Japan can act swiftly on its own if regional contingencies erupt. I think she does not want Japan to become overly dependent on the United States, and it's going to be a difficult balance to strike for fairly obvious reasons. So there's going to be closer cooperation on missile defense, on spatial situation and awareness, Indo-Pacific naval patrols, but also a lot of independent Japan action and development. I think she will also have to calibrate the China policy. She will avoid open confrontations. I think Japan, for the time being, will not be as confrontational with China as it was getting. And I think Trump is a major factor in that, rather than the personality of the new prime minister. I think she simply has to manage that. And I think that that is the direction it was going in anyway, because China has been improving, at least on the surface, some aspects of its trade relations and discussions with U.S. And Trump has been very unpredictable in terms of moves regarding Taiwan. So I think other countries also are extremely cautious to over-invest in a confrontational style with China, and I think that will prove to be true in her tenure. And I think, of course, inflationary pressures, wage stagnation, all these economic factors that have had a huge impact on Japan, on its demographic crisis, on the brain drain. She will have to figure out how to address that, and probably employ fiscal measures such as childcare subsidies and green transition incentives and corporate tax relief with defense expansion and grow and economic growth. It's going to be a very tough call, and um, I think part of this cyclical instability is the fact that the public, as I said, has very little time frame to give their leaders to deliver on expectations. I think the public is just tired of waiting.
Absolutely, absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the World According to Irina Shukerman on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was great as always.